The various events that have held sway in our world from the beginning of 2020 till date brought into limelight the manipulation, schemes and the weaponization of several human endeavors that the world had hitherto applauded. The innovations ascribed to science and technology in times past literally became exposed as instruments in the hands of eugenicists, arsonists and oligarchs, whose age-long ambition have been to subjugate and summarily depopulate the world. So when the COVID debacle hit the airwaves in 2020, one of their core focus was data management. Essentially to propel the propaganda of a pandemic so-called. While the world cringed with fear during the time, one key operation that had been unnoticed for many years was a large-scale weaponization of data.
We have to recognize that we are dealing with manufacturers of data and crisis producers. They're creating new data, and because they know you need data to work with, okay? Your inferences will come from the data that you use, that you analyze. So they're manufacturing data for you to use and come to conclusions. And your conclusions are definitely going to go in the way of their choosing because they created the data.
Historically, available data about pandemics such as the Spanish flu and swine flu have been proven to be largely manufactured and concocted to foster the age-long agenda of totalitarianism and world depopulation.
They keep claiming over 50 million people died at the Spanish flu. Question: whoever perused the data? Whoever did? You say it because they told you. Now you, exactly. Now you know they've been lying all the time. All the time.
The 1918 Spanish influenza. It's estimated that it killed between 50 and 100 million people worldwide. This catastrophic pandemic has been encased in a false narrative for over a century. An examination of the facts reveals a plethora of similarities between that false narrative of the pandemic in 1918 and the 2020 coronavirus pandemic. The 1918 pandemic did not emanate from Spain. It was not a flu, nor was it caused by a virus. In January 1918, an experimental meningitis vaccine made from the pus of horses was tested on soldiers. Gates wrote that shortly after being injected, soldiers exhibited flu-like symptoms, including cough, vomiting, and diarrhea. The reactions, he said, simulated the onset of epidemic meningitis. But Dr. Gates brushed it aside and declared it was not actual meningitis. One wonders what science Dr. Gates relied on. Influenza outbreaks were reported at 14 of the biggest armed force training camps. Recovered troops carried and transmitted the infection to healthy soldiers in the battlefields of Europe. When World War I ended on November 11, 1918, soldiers returned to their home, spreading the killer bacterial pneumonia worldwide. One of the most important eyewitnesses was Dr. Eleanor McBean. She witnessed the human carnage at the age of 13. She and her African-American family did not get vaccinated. They remained healthy throughout the pandemic. She became a doctor and authored several books, including The Poisoned Needle, 1957, Vaccination, the Silent Killer, 1977, and Swine Flu Expose, 1977. She provided very vivid descriptions. I'll read a little bit. When the flu was at its peak, all the stores were closed, as well as the schools, businesses, even the hospital, as the doctors and nurses had been vaccinated and were down with the flu. No one was on the streets. It was like a ghost town. We seemed to be the only family which didn't get the flu. So my parents went from house to house, doing what they could to look after the sick, as it was impossible to get a doctor. She wrote, that only those who were vaccinated perished. Sound familiar?
Yes.
And when the war ended, the Rockefeller Institute sent the deadly meningitis concoction for use in civilians in England, France, Belgium, Italy, and other Western European countries, thereby spreading the epidemic worldwide. Was the decision to ship the deadly vaccine abroad once they already knew what it was doing? Was it just for profit über alles, or was it part of a eugenics genocide playbook?
When I was a child, I thought like a child. Okay? Now that I've become a man, I've put away childish things. So, you know, the Spanish flu was so terrible. It was the worst ever. It's like when we were watching, during the prayer day, March 27th, you know, we had the screen up and we were watching as they were, Johns Hopkins University was scrolling the infected people and the deaths. And by the second, it was rising up in every country. Then I saw some countries that I knew, I knew that those countries didn't have, there was no way they could count. Johns Hopkins didn't have representatives on ground.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I knew those countries because I preached in those countries.
Yes, sir.
I knew they didn't have any data.
Yes, sir.
And yet the numbers were flying.
Yes, sir.
I said, how did they get that?
Yes, sir.
My name is John Cohen. It was 32 years ago. I worked for Larry Ellison at Oracle, and I was one of the first 1,500 people at Oracle. And I was the guy who set up this map. The company that makes the software that powers the map that's being used is a company based in California called ESRI. And 32 years ago, I was the guy at Oracle that was kind of one of the leads on the team that set up this map. So, you know.
This is the map that are generating all of these numbers with the alleged death that we're being told, yeah?
Correct. And so the source of the data from the map is one thing, right? And it's important to understand how these things work, these tools, right? So this is a software tool that is giving you a visual representation of data that, quite frankly, looks nothing more complicated than a spreadsheet. So the data behind this map is nothing more than just a big spreadsheet, right? And when you get into relational database design methodology, which is what I studied 32 years ago, 33 years ago, there are different ways to build a database, and then you can pull the data in and show it to people in all kinds of different ways. You know, you can use these tools to make people think that bad data is good news, or, you know, good data is bad news. And that's what we were looking at a week or so ago. I was showing Jason maps that were colored blue when everything was bad. And then I was showing him maps where things were colored brown when everything was bad. And so red is certainly used to connotate danger, right? That's just built into us. And the entire map is red. There's nothing but red. There is no other color. Nothing is yellow. Nothing is green. So it's a disaster. It's a
Yes,
global
from zero
panic.
to disaster in 2 seconds. No intermediate.
Right. So from a software perspective, this is, you know, if I were running the WHO or you were running the World Health Organization, and Ole, you're probably more qualified than the guy who's running it now.
In the heydays of the COVID debacle, data was unlawfully collated by agents of the oligarchs at the designated COVID testing centers, to prove that huge numbers of people across the world tested positive to the virus, whereas several of these people proclaimed positive never visited the centers nor undergo the test.
Can you explain why people who never did a test received information from the testing centers because they had their data? They had their names, their addresses, and the telephone numbers. And these people never had the test. They had only come in the line. They waited in the line, couldn't get far enough to get the test. They went back home, never tested, and yet they got the results. Some were negative and some were positive. How did they get it? Because it was all a fraud.
Well, it has nothing to do with actually getting tested for COVID-19, but instead the results. The quickest turnaround is about 48 hours, and the majority of the time it could take about a week to find out if you're infected with the virus or not. But the most recent issue, getting back COVID-19 test results that aren't even yours.
I get a phone call asking for me, and I said, yes, this is Mindy Clark, and they say, well, we want you to know that your test was positive. And I said, I looked at the phone like, positive for what? And they said, positive for COVID. And I said, there's no way possible. And she said, oh, yes. She said, you did the test. And I said, no, ma'am.
Mindy Clark had gone to the drive-through testing site at Manatee Rural Health. But before she was able to get swabbed, she left the line because she realized it was for people with symptoms only.
And I said, you need to take that off my record. She goes, well, we don't know now. You have to prove to us that you're negative.
She tested negative just 2 days later and also tested negative for the antibodies. And according to many of our viewers, this hasn't only happened to her. Clark says if she and many others have been incorrectly identified as positive in the state system so easily, how accurate are the numbers that are released daily?
It's sad, but it's a good thing. I want to tell you why it's a good thing. It's good because the world is discovering deception, the power of deception, and how they have been deceived for so long. Wake up. And if there's anything you're going to learn from this situation, what you're going to learn really is about deception. Because it's coming again. And in fact, already, what has happened is several of them who are involved in this hoax are planning for another one because they know this has failed, and so they just, picking up the pieces. They're just trying to see what can they get out of it.
And the next one, when it comes, could be a lot worse because the death rate here was like 0.3% across all age groups. It is tricky, as you say, because it's got to be global. And, maybe 50% of the risk of an emergence comes off of the continent of Africa, where you have lots of humans interacting with animal species. That's what we saw with HIV and Ebola. Of course, with flu and both SARS-CoV-1 and CoV-2, it came out of Asia. So we have to be ready for it to emerge anywhere. But the quicker we see it, the better. And so only a global organization can ask all the countries to do these exercises, ask them to report the data, and then understand, okay, for some of the developing countries, the global capacity will have to help them more. Whereas for the better off countries, it's simply a matter of setting the standards and having the right communication to get the data, constantly correct.
So for many years, the globalists have schematically manufactured data in all its forms with the master plan of implementing the age-long depopulation agenda and installing a one-world system of government.
They lied to you when they told you that millions of people died as a result of COVID. It's the reverse. Millions of people died as a result of the vaccinations. That's what killed the millions of people. Do you realize that there is no scientific proof that any one person died of COVID? Absolutely. Are you aware? There's no scientific proof that a single person died because of COVID. All they said was COVID related. They couldn't. And that's why in the beginning of it, they didn't want anybody who had died They didn't want any postmortem results. They didn't want it. They wanted people buried immediately, so there will be no proof as to what led to the death. It was a well masterminded deception, global deception.
My name's John O'Looney. I run a Milton Keynes based funeral service. I've been a funeral director for 16 years. 10 of those were spent working for Cooperative Funeral Care, one of the biggest funeral providers in the industry. And then 6 years ago I left funeral care and started up on my own to run my own funeral home. It just wasn't, so as the weeks went past, what was being portrayed on the TV and the news and every media outlet possible just wasn't what was happening on the ground. For example, there was no increase in deaths whatsoever. What we were seeing was increasing amount of people being labelled as a COVID death who'd had cancer or had dementia or had a heart attack. There was no actual increase in numbers. There was a decrease. There wasn't any, for example, I've been a funeral director for 16 years. There wasn't a single winter flu death. That's the first year ever in 16 years. Every one of them was relabelled as COVID. And then I took a phone call from a guy called John, who said that he was a government-sponsored guy working for, I believe it was called Pandemic Resilience, was the company that had been formed. And his job was to call all of the funeral directors in my area. Now, I hadn't quite seen through it yet, but I was kind of thinking, this is, you know, we're not seeing the death rate, and wondering when I was going to get ill, for example, and I wasn't getting ill. So I was making extra effort to ascertain the status, the COVID status especially, of everyone that I picked up. Now, doctors weren't attending, there was no COVID test present. I was going to care homes and collecting people. I would tell him, I picked a gentleman up who'd died from dementia. He'd been in the care home 5 years. I'd spoke to staff, they'd confirmed that. I'd looked at his records that they'd supplied me with. I'd spoke to the family, they confirmed he'd had onset dementia for 5 years. He was in the classic fetal position. There was no doctor present, there was no COVID test done. He wasn't a COVID death. He would insist this guy was a COVID death. The massive effort they were making to deliberately label everyone as a COVID death, that they just weren't COVID deaths.
So, it has become imperative for everyone to become conscious of the manipulation and weaponization of data in the current dispensation of science and technology under the guise of global health and safety measures.
Believe not every spirit, but try the spirits whether they are of God, because many false prophets are gone out into the world. Someone's telling you what's good for your health. As a Christian, listen to Jesus. Listen to his word. Now you are discovering the voices of deceivers, liars, traitors. So be strong, be courageous, don't give in.
An hypocrite with his mouth destroyeth his neighbor, but through knowledge shall the just be delivered. Proverbs 11 verse 9.